In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't just a general, he was the god of war. His Grande Armée was a force of 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. He had conquered a continent, but just 6 months later, 90% of them were gone, erased from existence. This is the story of how an army and an empire died in the snow. So, why did he do it? The target wasn't Russia, not really. It was Great Britain. Napoleon created the Continental System, a massive economic blockade designed to starve the British Isles of trade. But one man defied him, Tsar Alexander of Russia. He opened his ports to British ships, a crack in Napoleon's fortress Europe. For Napoleon, this was an act of treason that could not be ignored. His plan seemed simple, even brilliant. Invade Russia, force one decisive, massive battle, crush the Tsar's army, and be back home in 90 days. He launched the invasion in June, a river of men pouring into the vast Russian plains. But the Russians had a new, terrifying strategy taught to them by General Barclay de Tolly. Don't fight, retreat and burn everything. They called it scorched earth. As the Grande Armée marched deeper into Russia, they found no food, no water, and no shelter. Only ashes. The villages were ghost towns, the fields were black. But the first enemy wasn't the Russian army. It was the Russian summer. A brutal heat wave cooked the men in their wool uniforms, followed by torrential downpours. The rain turned the dirt roads into impassable swamps of mud. The heavy supply wagons carrying all the food, ammunition, and medical supplies sank to their axles. They were stuck. The thousands of horses pulling the cannons and wagons had nothing to eat but unripe green wheat. They contracted diseases and died by the thousands, their carcasses littering the roadside. Then came the diseases for the men. With no clean water, soldiers drank from muddy puddles, leading to a catastrophic outbreak of typhus and dysentery. Lice were everywhere. In the first 2 months before a single major battle was fought, Napoleon lost 50,000 men to starvation, exhaustion, and disease. Napoleon was getting desperate. He needed that one glorious battle to end it all. He finally got it on September 7th, at a small village called Borodino, just 75 miles from Moscow. What followed was the single bloodiest day of conflict in the 19th century. A horrific 12-hour meat grinder where cannons fired non-stop and men charged into walls of bayonets. Over 70,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. Napoleon technically won the field, but it was a hollow victory. The Russian army, though battered, was not destroyed. They simply retreated once more, drawing him deeper into the trap. A week later, Napoleon marched triumphantly into Moscow. He had captured the enemy's great historic capital. He expected a delegation from the Tsar to arrive at any moment, begging for peace. But Moscow was empty, a ghost town. 90% of the population had fled. It was eerily silent. That night, Napoleon discovered the true nature of the trap. Fires broke out across the city. The governor of Moscow, on the Tsar's orders, had set the city ablaze. From the windows of the Kremlin, Napoleon watched his ultimate prize, the key to his victory, burn to the ground. He had conquered nothing but a smoking ruin. This was his fatal mistake. Trapped in the ashes of Moscow, Napoleon waited. He waited for 35 days, clinging to the hope that the Tsar would negotiate. He sent peace offers. The Tsar never replied. The silence from St. Petersburg was his real enemy now. Then, on October 18th, the first snowflakes began to fall. It was an ominous warning. The next day, Napoleon finally gave the order he should have given a month earlier: retreat. General Winter had arrived. The temperature didn't just drop to freezing, it plummeted to 22 Fahrenheit, that's 30 Celsius. The soldiers were still wearing their tattered summer uniforms. The metal of their muskets became so cold, it burned their bare hands. Their boots, worn out from the 1,000-mile march, disintegrated, forcing them to wrap their feet in rags. The last of the horses died, their frozen bodies lining the road. Without them, the cannons were abandoned. The supply wagons were abandoned. The wounded were abandoned. Discipline completely collapsed. If you fell down from exhaustion, you were left behind to freeze to death in minutes. It became every man for himself. Starvation was total. Men gnawed on leather from their own bags. Then came the whispers, the horrifying reports of soldiers resorting to cannibalism to survive. And as if that weren't enough, the wolves came. Not the four-legged kind. These were Russian Cossacks, feared light cavalry on small, tough horses, perfectly adapted to the cold. They were ghosts in the blizzard, swarming the stragglers, picking off the weak at the back of the column, showing no mercy. The Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a 50-mile-long shuffling column of starving, freezing phantoms, haunted by Cossacks at every step. The Russians laid one final trap at the Berezina River. They had destroyed the main bridge, cornering what was left of Napoleon's army against the water's edge. The river wasn't frozen solid. It was a churning, deadly mass of ice floes. Crossing seemed impossible. In a final, desperate act of incredible bravery, 400 Dutch engineers waded into the freezing water to build 2 makeshift bridges. They worked for hours, ice forming on their beards and uniforms, hammering posts into the riverbed. Almost every single one of them froze to death where they stood, becoming ice statues in service to their emperor. As the terrified mob of soldiers and civilians began to cross, panic erupted. The Russian artillery found their range and opened fire on the crowded bridges. It was a massacre. Wagons, horses, men, women, and children were pushed into the icy river to drown. Then, one of the bridges broke under the strain. To save the crossing, the French engineers had to burn the remaining bridge, deliberately abandoning 10,000 of their own people on the far bank to be captured or killed by the advancing Cossacks. At this point, Napoleon knew the army was lost. He abandoned them. Disguised, he got into a fast sleigh and fled, racing 1,400 miles back to Paris to raise a new army before the full, catastrophic news of the disaster could reach his enemies. Back in Russia, the last few survivors staggered on. The legendary Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, personally commanded the tiny rearguard. On December 14th, Ney was reportedly the last French soldier to cross the Niemen River out of Russia, firing one last defiant shot into the blizzard before disappearing into the fog. Let's look at the final tally. 600,000 men invaded. Fewer than 100,000 staggered out. And of those survivors, only about 10,000 were still fit to fight. The Grande Armée, the most magnificent fighting force of its age, was dead. Napoleon had lost far more than an army. He had lost his myth of invincibility. The world saw that the god of war could bleed. Hearing the news, all of Europe rose up. Prussia, Austria, and Sweden joined Russia and Great Britain. This was the true beginning of the end. Napoleon, with his genius, would raise another army. He would fight more battles, and he would even win some. But he was now fighting a war on all fronts against enemies who knew he could be beaten. Less than 2 years later, he was defeated and exiled. The 1812 campaign was more than a military failure. It was an apocalypse. It redrew the map of Europe and showed that even the greatest empires can be broken, not by guns, but by mud, by lice, and by the unbelievable, terrible cold. The 500,000 men who died were not just numbers on a page. They were sons, fathers, and husbands, swallowed by the ambition of one man and the total indifference of the Russian winter. The disaster was so complete, it's still studied in military academies today as the ultimate lesson in hubris. It led directly to his final defeat at a place we all know, Waterloo. But the end of Napoleon wasn't decided on the fields of Belgium. It was decided here, in this frozen wasteland. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating and tragic as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more dives into history's most epic moments. See you next time.